Hello, everybody. Thank you for the warm welcome. I am Jason Rice. I am an SSP officer veteran as well as a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers veteran. I am an engineer. The talk today is related to my own experiences with the SSP. One of the things to keep in mind is that there are many SSP programs. There's not one. There are probably dozens. And if you think about it, somebody may be working on a component for a spacecraft or advanced technology, and they have no idea what they're doing, except that they're just piecing this part together. They are a member of the SSP, but they don't know it. So there are lots of pieces and parts to the SSP puzzle. And my discussion today is only about my own experiences within the SSP, within the IDARF program. Because of the extreme compartmentalization, there's a lot of information that people in one program aren't going to know about another. Even those at the very top of the rank structure are not going to know about other SSP programs. And we'll get into that in a few minutes, why they designed the system like that, why they designed the programs like that. And I think only disclosure when it happens, not if, when, because it will, when it happens, I think we'll find out a lot more about the various programs. Now, if you're looking at the screen here, you see, what is this wheel? This shows the Bilderberg group, how many people are involved in it, their interconnections, and this gets back to the cabal, their control of every aspect of our lives, from the media to education to national defense. This is a compartmentalization. The people that work for these, the people that operate in this world, are not entirely aware of the other aspects of the SSP that they may be involved with. So some of the things that we can expect to have happen as disclosure happens is that the only suggestion I can make is that expect anything and everything from one end of the spectrum to the other, because there will be momentous, joyful disclosure technologies that we'll find out about, but there will also be some very tough truths that we will have to work through. One of the things that I'd like to ask is there anyone in here that likes being lied to? Nobody? I didn't think so. I know I don't. Well, as disclosure happens, one of the things that people are going to have to deal with are the lies. Individually, we're going to go through, as well as civilization, as well as the entire planet, what is referred to as 5 stages of grief, right? You've got the denial, anger, that was one for me, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. List of offenses, there are going to be lies, there's going to be cheating, you find out about stealing, murder, greed, pretty much every form of bad actions, some of the things that we'll find out. Now, they've been perpetrated on our mothers, our fathers, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. And these things go back 80 plus years as far as the plan. These guys, to get us all under one world government. And despotic control means that nobody can argue with them. So that was the plan. Elected officials, unelected officials, they're involved. People in corporations that are involved. There's people in every level of government. Now, one of the things that I'm sure you're going to say is, well, gosh, you know, I'm awake. I've got my eyes open, and you know, throw it at me. Come on, give me all the truth. Well, the only thing that I would say to that is that be careful what you ask for, because while we may be able to handle all the truths, how about your neighbors or your family or your coworkers? And the same thing about toxins and getting used to it from a standpoint of the global consciousness. How are you going to react to your family or friends or neighbors that are going through those 5 stages of grief? How is it going to affect us? Because, you know, we're caring, we're compassionate, we want to help people. So naturally, it is going to affect us. We're not machines, we're not cold, we're not going to just sit idly by while our loved ones are crying over the fact that they've been lied to for their entire life. Okay, so what is the Secret Space Program? Again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, one of them is the IDARF, the Interplanetary Defense and Reaction Forces. So where did that come from? Well, in order to get there, we're going to have to go back in time a little bit and talk about some of the history going back to the 1930s. We went from almost seemingly overnight from advanced anti-gravitic technologies and a wide range of other technologies, medical, science, physics. So let's get into the history, how we got there. 1930s Germany. The Germans, prior to World War II, were very interested in esoteric mysticism, as well as a wide range of alternative views on life and connections and energies. They scoured the entire planet looking for further clues and more information. Now, in 1936-37 is when they began their contacts and communications with the Draco. All right, well, who are the Draco? Well, they are an alien race that is a reptilian based, that are not very nice, to put it mildly. These are negative ETs. They are definitely service to self-oriented. So shortly after their first contacts with the Draco, the Germans decided, okay, well, they're saying that there's some technology down in Antarctica, so we should go down there. So in 1938-39, they had an expedition down there. The SS Neuschwabenland was the ship, and they carved out a particular area. And I think you'll see that the area they carved out is in it's in the Queen Maud Land area on the map there. And on the right-hand side, you'll see those orange pieces are actually mountains. So the entire boundary from a defensive, from a military standpoint, is essentially an offset. It gives them some property and protection and some defense in depth from the mountains, where they ended up putting Base 211, the first one. So let's go through the timeline a little bit. They departed Antarctica in February 1939 and made it back to Germany in a couple months later, April time frame. And guess what else happened just a few short months later? Well, that's exactly right. They invaded Poland in September, 4 or 5 months later. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't believe in those kinds of coincidences. So they must have seen something, found something, right? Well, they were told what was there, and they confirmed it. And then once they confirmed it, that furthered their plans for world domination. And so 1940s, let's go through a little bit. They started building out and stocking their base in Antarctica so that they would be able to contain, feed, house upwards of 300,000 people. There were thousands involved with it. Most of them were native Germans, so that they could keep the information compartmentalized. Again, there's that word. They were able to use the geothermal properties underneath the mountains for their power source initially. Later on, they developed alternative advanced technologies, so they wouldn't have to rely solely on geothermal. But it was there. And they already had some advanced civilization that had been abandoned that they were told to go investigate by Draco. Draco wanted that technology. So, around 1940, the Germans make their first visit to the moon in the Hannibal 1. And the same time period back on Earth was the period when the German Navy had commissioned some auxiliary cruisers, which basically are converted civilian ships. One of them was named Penguin, and the other one, surprisingly enough, was named Atlantis. Again, another interesting convenience. So during that time in the war, the Cabal was in charge and had resources in which they had loaned Germany money. Germany was paying back the loans. They had financed them through their rebuilding efforts in the 30s, as well as financing their military expeditions of the early 40s. What happened is that Germany decided that, hey, you know, we really don't need this central bank. We're going to instead start bartering with other countries so that we don't have to use a fiat centralized currency. Well, this of course upset the central banks, and the central bankers decided to get other people involved, and voila, the world is at war. 1941, the US declares war on Germany. Now, this same time frame was when they were working on building up their base, and so the U-boat activity after 1941, they were able to, well, their two auxiliary cruisers had been sunk by that time, but they had enough U-boats in which they didn't need any surface ships. So they were using the subsurface ships for transportation to and from their base. They had advanced technologies on their U-boats so that they didn't have to surface. They were also some of the first stealth technology that had ever been released. 1944, Germans returned to the moon, and they're scouting for a base at this point. They also visit Mars for scouting purposes as well. 1945 through 48, the Germans start infiltrating the Allies, and their purpose was to get people in place. And they started off with, getting people in the military, getting people enlisted, getting people involved in politics, so that they could get them deeply embedded into the Allies' governments. The public portions that have been advertised are Operation Paperclip. 1946-47 was when the Antarctic Germans, the AG, started negotiations for a moon base, because they found out that the property on the moon is occupied by other alternate alien races, and so they had to negotiate with someone to get a base, to get property, to get a lease. The Draco had done their homework and had assured that nobody else would deal with the Germans, so the Germans were forced to work with the Draco. So 1947 was when the Antarctic Germans enacted their lunar base. Now, what did the Draco want in exchange for 20 acres of lunar landscape? And I tell you, 20 acres is really not that big. There's not much you can do with 20 acres except for, building down, which is what they eventually did. The Draco wanted 225 humans and 25 years worth of first refusal rights on the technology. That's what they wanted. At first they wanted all females. And the Germans knew that in order for them to have a successful civilization, they needed as many females for propagation purposes as they could. So they didn't even bother with answering that. Came back later. 6 months it took them to finally reach an agreement. They came up with still the 225 citizens and 25 years of technology first refusal rights. Now, to give you an idea the kind of negativity that these Draco are, when they landed to come collect their prisoners, they used technology to freeze people, to lock them in place, and they also used memory alteration technology that was feeding everybody in that cave images of mutilations, images of every type of atrocity imaginable, and the people couldn't do anything about it. Why did they do that? Well, because they thought it was funny. It was their own sense of humor, as something that is sick by any normal standards. 2 guards escaped because they were outside the freeze field, for lack of a better way of putting it, the mobilization field. They were able to make it to the exit, and that was how the security forces were able to discover what had happened, the images that they were sent, the things that they were experiencing while they were in that chamber. After that, the 278 losses, because eventually those 2 guards suicided 5 years later, and they vowed that they would never use their own people again. So who would they use? The rest of the planet. So between the years of 1947 and 1952, the Antarctic Germans lost about 1,000 people on building out their moon base. Some of them had to do with building the enclosures so that they would seal. Some of it had to do with sensor technology, because in order to operate in a vacuum, you need to have remote sensors, and they were still working on that technology. Again, you got to think that the Antarctic Germans had a mixture of extremely advanced technology and 1940s technology. Now, they were on an incredible learning curve because their lives depended on it, but that was what they were working with. Now, there's a lot of things that happened in 1947. In February, well, starting in November of 46, the U.S. government had sent a flotilla of naval ships down to Antarctica to test Antarctic operations. Now, given the amount of time between the end of World War II and the fact that they had close to 5,000 people down there, I don't buy that. The information that I'd gotten while I was in the SSP also didn't support that. So February, Operation High Jump ends, and they sail back to the United States, returning to Washington in April. President Truman issues his executive order in March, in which the loyalty of all federal employees would be evaluated by the FBI. This is when that started, for all federal employees having to go through background checks to test their evaluation for their loyalties. Now, at the time, the McCarthyism was running really hot, so they blamed it on the communists. But what was actually happening is that the Antarctic German infiltrators, that's what they were really after. Later that year, guess what happened in July? There's one that everybody should know. The Roswell event, that's right. Now, do you find it highly suspect that the same month that the Roswell event happened is also when the National Security Council and the CIA were created? Same month. Now, the CIA took over from the operation of State Security OSS, which was handled by the military. After the president enacted the CIA, it was now handled by civilians, which meant that the military was out. They washed their hands of it, that's right. They were able to get the civilians in there so that the civilians could then control. September of later that year, Majestic 12 was created, again for dealing with alien politics or alien recovered craft or technologies. Now, when Admiral Byrd left Antarctica, he took a message with him. Now, there are alleged reports that he made a statement to a newspaper about the threat and about an enemy capable of incredible feats. Well, the other message that he took with him was from the Antarctic Germans, in which they were requiring a meeting so that they could negotiate a truce, a ceasefire. Well, the Antarctic Germans needed to have some time so that they could build up their defenses. That's what they wanted to do. They had a fleet of anti-gravitic craft, but it wasn't enough to take on an entire globe of people or allies that would have been aligned against them. So they wanted some time to build up their forces. And they also knew that the Allies had nothing that could compare to their technologies. December, Operation Windmill was published as we're going to make our base down in Antarctica, which in actuality what it was is part of the negotiations between the Antarctic Germans and the rest of the planet. Guess what happened in the next year? Operation Mockingbird had its starts. So these all go back to a very busy 1947, 1948. Now, Frank Wisner was a member of the CIA and was put in charge of propaganda and the controlling of the media. After what happened with Roswell, they did not want to go through another incident like that. So they decided that they would take it on head first. Well, how do you do that? Well, you pay a bunch of people that are employees of mainstream media to do what and when and how and whatever you need them to say. Operation Mockingbird. Now, in 1972, it came out. Oh my gosh, that's 25 years later. Well, do you really think that it stopped just because it went public? No, it did not. So in February, Operation Windmill 2 was finished up, in which the Antarctic Germans reached a ceasefire with the Cabal. Now, they had expected a formal treaty to follow, and so what they wanted was, again, to buy some more time. So that was what happened in 1948. The ceasefire agreement established the Antarctic Germans as a sovereign nation. Their existence was to be kept secret. The reasons for that have to do with the Antarctic Germans were threatening to go public with advanced technologies, and the Cabal did not want that to happen because they wanted to maintain control. The other thing that the Cabal had going for it at the time was that if the Antarctic Germans had gone public, there is a very strong possibility that the rest of the globe, the personnel, the citizens would have said, you know what, even if it means nuclear annihilation for us all, let's get rid of those Nazis once and for all. So they kept it secret because the politicians knew that they may not have a choice if it went public. They would be out of their control from the citizens of the planet. They established their embassies. They have at least one senior executive and thousands of corporations. Now, what kind of corporations? We're talking about Ivy League schools. We're talking about engineering and research schools. We're talking about defense contractors, agriculture, medical, research hospitals, banks, everything imaginable. They had at least one senior executive, because again, they had 300,000 people to do something with. And their plan was to infiltrate the rest of the planet so that they would have their own people in place. One of the consolations that they provided to the Cabal was that they gave them base theories, not technology, but base theories. So they had to do their own homework. Now, having their own people in place meant that essentially they were giving themselves advanced theories. So no harm, no foul. because they're just giving it to themselves, right? Well, their own people, being executives in these companies, the process of advancement, well, you know, you've got somebody who has a leg up already because they've got advanced technology knowledge, and suddenly they are on a fast track to the CEO or senior executive or any number of other positions. Now, 1948 through 1954, the cabal was stalling for time because they knew that they could not stand toe-to-toe with the Antarctic Germans. The technology level of the Antarctic Germans was far beyond anything that they could handle. I mean, they tried with a naval task force, and the naval task force was sent packing. So, 1949, the USSR fires their first nuclear bomb. Now, there's evidence that shows that the U.S. gave the Soviet Union the plans. Now, my thinking is that they were trying to spread out more information so that they could keep the Antarctic Germans in check and get more people that are standing up against you. Then you have a better chance of coming out ahead. The Chinese Communists take control that year. 1950, the Korean War starts. Hey, we can't go to the treaty because we're fighting a war. Please give us a break. 1950 to 1954, McCarthy's Red Scare. Again, the U.S. government was searching for the moles and the spies from the Antarctic Germans. Now, one of the things that they provided as a good faith, at least that's what they called, the cabal provided the London Debt Agreement, in which all of Germany's, now conventional Germany, not Antarctic Germany, the Antarctic Germans still had a connection and a love for their homeland. So the cabal took advantage of that and said, okay, look, give us some more time and we will forgive all the war debt before and after World War II. So this goes back to World War I. Now, we think that the United States debt of, what, 22 trillion is high? How about 1,000 trillion that they forgave in equivalent modern dollars? $1,000 trillion. Free and clear. That's what they gave to Germany. Now, during this time, the Antarctic Germans were working on their moon base. Again, they had lost about 1,000 people. They had also started working on their Mars base, New Berlin. And the problem with New Berlin is that, well, their goals for New Berlin was that they had to invade the space and take it over from another alien race. Now, they lost about 17,000 soldiers during that campaign. Now, it may not sound like a lot. One is too many, but if you add up all the Allies' losses during World War II, this is what that accounts for from a perspective of their total population. Now, it also meant that it was some of the most physically fit, some of the most active. These were the people that they lost. And so they knew that they needed to fix their personnel problem. And one way to do that was to acquire more people for some of the jobs and positions that their people couldn't fill or didn't want to fill. So they stepped up their pressure on the cabal. UFO sightings blossomed, exploded during that time frame. There were military pilots that gave testimony about a UFO craft that would shadow them, that the pilot would give them a finger and then fly off, and that the pilot looked humanoid. There were mass sightings over D.C. There were mass sightings over New York City. I believe that was an Andromeda class, the one over New York City, and we'll see that in just a second. That was in 1950. Now, the final straw that the Antarctic Germans used to bring the cabal to the table was they did a nuclear demonstration strike on a heavy cruiser, coincidentally, on its way back from Bikini Atoll during the U.S.'s nuclear testing. The Antarctic Germans exploded a nuclear weapon close enough to affect the heavy cruiser from the EMP. Now, it wasn't close enough that it burned it up. It didn't do that. They just wanted to disable it. They wanted to get the United States' attention. Now, of course they did, as it took them 12 hours to get the ship moving again, and then they limped back to Hawaii. But the Antarctic Germans took it a step further because they knew that the U.S. government would probably say, hey, you know, there's a chance that, you know, those Navy personnel were too close to Bikini Atoll, and that was the explosion that knocked out the power and all the electronics and electrical systems on the heavy cruiser. The Antarctic Germans weren't taking any risk. So they had filmed the entire operation and sent boxes of these films to pretty much every leader in the world, so that there was no question that, number one, they had nukes, they were willing to use them, and their requests was they wanted to meet to come up with a formalized treaty. Well, that pretty much did it. So, as we mentioned a minute ago, the AG finished up their Mars military campaigns in 1954. That was also the same year that they developed their memory wipe technology. So 55 through 59 was when the Antarctic Treaty negotiations began. Now, Antarctica, I imagine that everybody here has read or heard some things about Antarctica. I mean, it's about the size of the United States. It has every natural resource, from oil and coal to uranium to gold and silver. Now, has there been another spot on the planet that corporations wouldn't go into to drill for oil? Think about the depths that they would go to in the ocean, or the fracking, or the lengths that they will go to. Well, why didn't they do it in Antarctica? It's got all these resources. Well, it's because of the Antarctic Treaty. There were two components to the Antarctic Treaty. There was a public version, and then there was a classified version. Operation Deep Freeze 1 and 2 was the operation in which the Cabal had built and established their base in Antarctica, and it also allowed for them to go through the negotiations with the Antarctic Germans. This time was also when the Antarctic Germans continued their political espionage, because they wanted to infiltrate every country, not just one, but every country, every major corporation, every major organization on the planet. That was how they were going to run their things, and that's how they were able to gain control over technology. So 1959 was the year that the Antarctic Treaty was enacted. Now, what did the Antarctic Treaty, the classified portion, what did it do? Well, it granted the Antarctic Germans about 150,000 personnel from the rest of the world. Now, what does that mean? They were going to pick them up from a place and time of their choosing. They had assured the rest of the leaders of the world that they would pay them and take care of them and feed and house them and give them fair medical treatment and anything that they needed. Give them the opportunity to become German citizens if they so chose at the end of 5 years. If they didn't, oh well, okay, they would send them back home. That didn't happen. Surprise. Also, as part of the Antarctic Treaty, is that they had at least one Antarctic German on the governing board of directors. So not only do they have senior executives, at least one, the larger corporations had 5 to 10, but they've got now their own people on the board of directors. And thousands of worldwide corporations, universities, medical research facilities, banks, financial institutions, you name it. The other portion of their plan was to have at least one executive, one of their citizens on the executive branch of every government on the planet, at least one. The United States had multiple civilians from the Antarctic Germans within the government. Now, again, their society was to remain classified. They didn't want it coming out. because they didn't want the world ganging up on them, and the cabal would lose their power and control if that happened. So it was a win-win for both of them. The AG stopped and ceased their overflights and their shadowing of both civilian and military aircraft. Through the 60s, the cabal and the Antarctic Germans continued their cat and mouse game. The United States effort to put a man on the moon was an opportunity for siphoning off millions of dollars to invest it into black projects. They used, the Antarctic Germans, their embedded citizens to great effect, because if they had a technology that turned out, well, this has a lot of promise, and this may be something that would actually work in a military or civilian field. Well, they used their citizens, both in the government and in the corporations, to either close the project down publicly and take it black, or to transfer it completely. So that's why you end up seeing, looking through the records in a Google search, a lot of technologies that just poof, disappeared during the 60s. Well, this is why. The AG and the cabal both continue to work on their mind control programs, and this includes technology as well as pharmaceuticals during the 60s. Now, keep in mind that the World War II Germans, the Third Reich, had pioneered a lot of things, and included among them were mind control. And so the scientists and engineers and doctors and technicians that were part of the Antarctic German society, they had and continued their mind control programs. Well, the cabal wasn't going to be turned out, so they started their own, which we can see and hear about now, some of the disclosure that's coming about relating to the use of LSD on prisoners, and they're trying attempts to do mind control. Well, that's just scraping the very surface of it. When disclosure happens again, we'll find out the full depth of how deep this particular rabbit hole goes. Now, the 1960s is also when the AG built their new base, New Wurzburg. That was their second city. They also were building out their first carrier task group. The AG also expanded further into the solar system, including Ceres, the moons around Saturn, the Kuiper Belt, the Oort Cloud. There's so many resources out there that all it takes is setting up a base and operations, and then you can go and find your own small planetoid that has whatever you need. So that's what they were doing. This is also the time frame that they had obtained the jump gate technologies. During this time frame was when the 5-year loaner program had ended. Now, they were supposed to return these people, right? They weren't kidnapped per se, but what happened is that they would return them and then re-abduct them, or they would write false death reports. So they ended up keeping about 90% of the people that they had acquired from that deal. This was also the time frame in which the cabal had learned more about some of the threats to Earth from certain alien sectors. Any advanced dimensional, scalar, time, advanced physics, those were the projects that were buried. So let's get into the 70s. The cabal are continuing to buy as much time as they can, because still they know that, number one, they're infiltrated, and there's not much they can do about it. They tried to do something with the McCarthy era, but that didn't really work out so well. Incidentally, Senator McCarthy died 3 years after stopping the Red Scare at Bethesda Medical Center, same place that the former Secretary of Defense died. The The 1970s are when the cabal learned that the Antarctic Germans had memory wipe technology. Before then, they hadn't known about it. So the mind wipe technology was really on par with the Manhattan Project, because it allowed a government to operate in 100% certainty that the information that was going out with the personnel was locked down. So they were able to keep people from remembering things, so they had nothing to tell. You got nothing to tell, you're not a security risk. And the cabal really wanted that technology. So it took them a few years, but eventually, in 1979, they had a joint KGB-CIA operation in which they had gotten one of the security forces from the Antarctic Germans to turn. And they acquired the technology and made it look like an accident that happened at altitude over the Pacific with nothing left in an expanding ball of white plasma. Now, they took that and reverse engineered it. It took them a few years to get that done. 1972 was also the time frame that the Draco 25-year first refusal rights had ended. So after that time frame, the Antarctic Germans were able to keep the technologies that they had acquired or were digging up. They reached their targeted self-sustaining worker population for their outlying colonies, their outlying manufacturing facilities, the locations out in the rest of the solar system. The Antarctic Germans started working on their own time travel. What they found was that there were problems, temporal interference, if they messed around or tried to monkey with timelines in the past. What they found, strangely enough, was that when they would go back and try and change something by altering whether someone crossed the street here or there, they didn't get hit by a car. Well, what they found was that within a reasonable amount of time, the person would die anyway. Something else would happen. Or the outcome that they were trying to avoid would happen anyway. And so now they're dealing with multiple problems in the past, and so they stopped, thankfully. But I found it interesting that that was one of the things that they discovered through trying to manipulate with time, was that the things that they were trying to prevent or ended up happening anyway. So 1980s. 1982 was when the cabal finished their reverse engineering of the mind wipe technology. The time frame that they had built their technology for memory wipe was also the same time frame that Voyager 1 and 2 were passing the Jupiter-Saturn area. And one of the things that Voyager 1 did for the cabal was it informed them just how much build-out the Antarctic Germans had, just how much infiltration alien races were making into our solar system. It scared them. They didn't realize just how much the Antarctic Germans had built out. And so they altered their plans for world domination to speed up the timeline. Originally, they were thinking that they would do it over a period of a century or more. Well, they shortened the timeline to make it happen faster. Now, the reasons and how they did that was by you create a disease and you create the cure at the same time. You poison the food. You dumb down the education system. You keep promoting a fiat currency system. You conduct false flags so that the people ask for more security, so that the people are wanting to have a security state. So eventually, that's what they were wanting to do, is to get under a single despotic one-world government. Well, that was around the same time frame that the Antarctic Germans, around 1986, discovered that their memory wipe technology had been stolen. And they did a few things in response to that. The destruction of the Space Shuttle Challenger was one, and then 2 months later, the destruction of the cooling towers at Chernobyl was the second one. They also moved all of their manufacturing and R&D off planet, and they sent a plain brown paper package with a non-operational memory wipe technology to the President of the United States and to the President of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Both of them got a non-operational memory wipe device with the time, date, and stamp from 1979 on the box. They would have done more, but the Antarctic Germans were worried about the cowboy U.S. President Reagan doing and resulting to nukes. So they left it at that. Plausible deniability. The 1990s, the moving of the Antarctic Germans of the majority of their civilization and their R&D and their manufacturing off planet now changes them over to the Mars Germans. So just that's my term. The people that I met while deployed just referred to themselves as Germans. So, but this is just my terminology for keeping track of it. So in 1990, the Mars Germans acquired a new property on the moon so that they did not have to be as close to the Draco. Well, their lease originally included a clause that if they were to get out of it, they had to find a new tenant. Well, where do you think they found a new tenant at? The Cabal. All right? So they didn't have to go far. It was right there. Well, what did the Cabal have to pay for this moon lease? Well, they ended up paying for the moon lease with 25,000 ground troops so that the Mars Germans could use them for border control. Well, what that turned out to mean was the conquering of planets. So, in order for the Cabal to get their moon base, they provided 25,000 troops. Now, where did they come from? Well, they came from every country on the planet that has a central bank. So, 1991 was when the Cabal and the Mars Germans signed the Cooperative Action Treaty for the Cabal takeover of the moon base, as well as the creation of IDARF, Intergalactic Defense and Reaction Forces, the fleet, the SSP program that I was involved in. The Earth units were split into two separate groups. There was the 3rd Panzer Division and the 4th Panzer Division. Now, the unit that I was a part of was the 3rd Panzer Division. And we were told that we would be helping indigenous populations defend their planet from an alien aggressor that was there to wipe them out. Now, what we didn't realize was that the alien aggressors, as well as our own forces, were being controlled and manipulated by the Draco. They were controlling both sides of it. Now, again, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the propaganda that they spread was that the IDARF was there to help other planets fight off invasion. Now, who wouldn't want to do that? Sure, it's service to others. We're going to help them defend their home turf. Well, if they had told us the truth was that we were all operating under the same command structure, then they would have had major mutinies. There would have been a lot of fighting internally, and I think that it would have turned out very differently. So they did not tell the truth. Again, more of those lies. So my involvement in IDARF. The first 18 months were locked up in training. The training included 8 months at an underground facility that was referred to as the FIG, the Fort Indiantown Gap cave structure. Now, if you can imagine something the size of an NFL stadium underground, with that much open space, probably another 5 or 6 stories above that. We weren't allowed in that area because they claimed it was radioactive. So, but it was at least 32 stories high. So, you know, it's a big structure. It's all underground. It was essentially a small city so that we would have the space and the room to do all the training and everything that we needed to do. So the first 8 months were when we learned how to work with our own nanite enhancement therapies. The next 6 months we spent on the moon learning about shipboard operations, firefighting. It takes time for ground troops to learn all the different things that they need to do in order to get deployed from a ship to the ground. And then the last 4 months of my training was spent on Mars, in which we were doing combat deployment training. And it was essentially life in a suit, life in a combat suit for those last 4 months. Around the top of the facility, there were these steel platforms that they used to great effect. I remember when I first walked in and I would see up to 175 feet of rope with a carabiner at the end, just kind of dangling and moving around. It was very surreal because it was like they each had their own frequencies. And so my first thought was, why do they have trapeze training? Well, it turns out that it was anti-gravitic training. And so you have to go through the process, and the lines were for safety. It was essentially a small city. It included a range, included hand-to-hand combat areas, hand-to-hand training, classrooms. A lot of the first 8 months of our training involved learning how to use our nanite enhancement therapies. And there's a technique that is a biofeedback, where you are able to identify every part of your body and which parts and what feels like what. Well, if you've got a small cyst on one of your knuckles, you'll know exactly what that feels like. That allows you to use the nanite enhancement therapies to great effect for muscle control, for being able to turn on the night vision, for being able to turn on the auditory enhancements, for being able to turn down the need for sleep, for being able to turn off the need for food so that you don't get the growling stomach. I'd say the biggest piece of our initial training was incorporating the nanite enhancement therapies. After finishing up the training, we were deployed to what I'm referring to as Planet 1. Now, I don't recall the name of this planet, but this was where we came up against the werewolf hybrids. They are 8 to 9 feet tall and a mechanical, biological being. They had hoses and different mechanical parts that were exposed through their skin. They carried a bladed projectile weapon with them. That was a cryogenically operated projectile weapon. There was, before we get into the destruction, I don't want to concentrate on that. The type of planet that this was, where we were stationed at, was reminds me a lot of Holland, in that the canals were the main method for moving around the city. So there were canals everywhere in the cities that we were deployed to. So that gives you an idea of what they look like. These pictures are from Holland, but it gives you a good idea of what they look like, as well as what the hybrid werewolves looked like. Now, the planet was about 2% larger than Earth. It had 60% landmass and 40% freshwater, 2 moons. Planet 2, which is Calidus 3, is the name of the planet that I have recalled. That was our next deployment, and we were there for 67 months. Now, these are the spider bear-like hybrids. Again, these are created beings specifically for a purpose. Now, they included anti-gravity within their biological mechanical makeup, so that they were able to change directions, alter their line of attack on a dime. This planet, Calidus 3, had a 32-hour day, and it was about the same size as Earth, maybe 4 or 5% larger. This landmass on Planet 2 had about 70% land and 30% freshwater. Again, freshwater, no salt water. This one had 4 moons, and the black moon that was there, we had named Waldo because it was so hard to find. So the joke was, where's Waldo? Their settlements were all below 50 degrees latitude, and none were ever built over 60 degrees. The population of about 4 billion when we made our first landfall. unfortunately, that was severely decreased. Their civilization was at about the start of the Industrial Revolution equivalent here on Earth. So they had some technologies. Again, think gauges and steam and tubes, but nothing compared to modern advanced technologies. Their governments were locally organized and run, either a village or a town elder or town elders. They did not have large countries under single governments. The third planet that we went to, I was there for 15 months. This was the first planet encountered that had more than just a humanoid race. This planet also had a Cyclopean race as well as an insectoid kind of race. Now, the Cyclopean looked just like regular humanoids except for the single eye, and they were also somewhat telepathic. Now, the insectoid race was very telepathic in how they communicated. Now, they were not telekinetic or some of the other psychological or psych abilities, but that they communicated telepathically. The first 15 months we were there, again, our MO was to help the civilian governments and the civilian population get organized, help them build up their stores, help them to create a defense industry so that they could supply their own people with weapons that they needed. And so our mission on this particular planet was challenging beyond what we had experienced before because of the presence of the two other races. They had already been fighting and warring with each other for over a century, and so they didn't trust each other, and it was made our job a lot harder because we had to get them all pulling in the same direction if they were going to survive. Well, it just so happens that the insectoids didn't trust any humans or humanoids, and there were incidents that started happening because, again, we were trying to get them to get on board, and they didn't like some of the things that the leadership was doing, and they struck back. One of the things that they ended up striking back was a shuttle that I happened to be on at one time. The medical injuries I'd sustained during that shuttle crash were too much, and the local medical facilities weren't enough, so I was shipped back to Mars for 11 months of regeneration therapies and recovery, and also learning to use my nanite enhancements again in the new limbs that I had been given. When those 11 months of medical treatment and relearning were over, I was sent back to Calidus 3 to help with the rebuilding efforts, and it gave me a chance, an opportunity to see what happened after the war, what they were doing. And the war period, they were very strict on the use of additional advanced technologies. And what that means is they wouldn't let us use it. Now, I realized later the reason for that was because they were trying to get the losses as high as they could before they started allowing the use of advanced technologies. After the war, Calidus 3, it was just the opposite. How fast can we get to a super advanced technology? And they opened all the gates. Now, this turned their civilization upside down because their religious beliefs, and they had their own versions, their family structures, their town structures. It forced them to change the way that they did things from a family level on up through the top of their civilization. Now, surprisingly enough, when I got back to Calidus 3, I also learned that there had been a number of families that were given charge of certain geographical areas. Now, sounds awful familiar. There are a number of families here on Earth that have, shall we say, responsibilities that they feel that they are entitled to. What it turns out that was happening through these false flags was they were setting up cabal operations. If you can imagine they were trying to set up the planet for a cabal-like operation. They didn't want to wait 100 years or more to reach a single world government. So they sped it up. They made it go faster. That was the reason behind the war and all the losses, because these people were willing to agree to the terms because the alternative was defeat and extinction. So the whole purpose was to speed up the one world government process by the techniques that they used. They didn't have to wait 100 years. They did it in about 10. Now, when I was there, I was able to help them rebuild, help them to build orbital facilities. I recall standing on the observation deck of one in particular, in which it was a large glass wall, and when I say glass, it's transparent steel, and which was looking out over the planet. And I could remember looking out and seeing lights on the shadow areas and seeing the rest of the planet lit up and feeling like I was standing on the edge of space. It was unimaginable. We completed a lot of missions in which we were bringing people from the sticks or the boonies or from the extremely rural areas and helping them to make their way into more urbanized areas so that the governments that had been set up, those 12 families, could provide a place for them to work. How nice. Food and water and shelter and taxes and fiat currency and all the other things that came with it. Now, I did that for 26 months before my next deployment, which was returning to be a trainer. The policy of IDARF is that they do not allow any trainers, any people, any soldiers to become trainers unless they have served at least one combat deployment. And their reasoning is actually quite simple. It's combat Darwinism. If you survive, then you are eligible or can teach. So I went back to the 333rd Training Regiment, in which I was helping to train new soldiers. One of the questions that I get is, well, how did that work out? What did you think about that? Well, that was around the time that I had started putting pieces together and realizing the duplicity of the false flags. And so I had mixed feelings, because here I am helping to train these soldiers to go out and to do the same things that I had done to help defend these planets. And you know, I was on one hand very proud of the soldiers and what they had done and overcome, and the training that they had accomplished and all of the many things that they were able to do. But I was not happy about it because of the duplicity of what was involved. Now, if I had spoken out, they probably would have mind wiped the memory from me so that I would continue on as a non-troubling, non-problem soldier. Now, I don't recall if that had happened, but knowing myself, and I think that is one of the challenges that we are faced with, is know yourself. And knowing myself, I wouldn't have been able to stay quiet. Now, one of the deals is that in order for them to use some of the technologies, they had to do everything within their power to return each of the soldiers back to their departure time and place, which meant they couldn't space me or get rid of inconvenient problems. What it means is that they would have used a mind wipe technology to help erase those nagging problems.